Good day. I welcome you to the subject of mythology and folklore, and today we will be solely talking about myths. I know many of you are already familiar with it, and most likely you have probably read stories coming from different myths. But today we will have an in-depth discussion about its nature, origin, types, and classifications. But first, let us know our learning objectives. At the end of the lesson, the student will be able to discuss myths from various cultures in terms of their origins, nature, categories, and functions, differentiate between mythology and folklore, and express appreciation for the wisdom of the past. So what is a myth? A myth is a traditional story, especially one concerning the early history of people or explaining some natural or social phenomenon, and typically involving supernatural beings or events. So most of the time, the characters in mythologies are supernatural beings, superhumans, or ordinary people guided by the help of a supreme being. The theme of myths centers around miracles, the supernatural, and different superstitious events. It is concerned solely with the character and nature of God's operation, concentrating emphasis on his relationship with the world and with the man. So myths reflects the basic principles of one's religion. It talks about the different gods existing in one's religion, stories about their lives, and how they interacted with humans before. And it tells of a deity and thus provides an account of the origins. Myths are stories that explains why the world is the way it is today, and it aims to give an explanation for a phenomena, telling stories how they came to be. It also aims to explain the mysteries of the world. Now let's discuss about the correlation of myth and time. There is a connection between the myth's original character and the period of time the historical occurrence takes place at. Actually, there's a lot of published articles and studies that proved that some of the characters in mythologies actually existed in real life. Like for example, the king and prince of Troy, King Priam and Paris, and also King Midas. So these people might have actually existed. The hypothesis about them is regarded as real, but there is no evidence that the fictional occurrence has actually taken place. The people, the time of their existence, and the time the stories are told may actually be true and aligned, but still, there is no concrete evidence that the stories about them really happened, so we cannot consider this as facts. Moving on, let's discuss about myth and cult. Without association with cults, myths may exist, having been totally removed from cults and given a continuing existence as stories only. Yet myth, not only in most instances, but also by the virtue of its existence as a narrative or history of origins, is so closely linked to cults that its role in cults belongs to their meanings. So myth and cults are two different but closely interlinked things. This is because myths explains the origin of cults. It explains their rituals and beliefs. And like myth, cults have many divinities. Though they may be similar in a lot of things, this too is so different from one another and should not be used interchangeably. Proof of this is that cults existed before myths. Now let's discuss about some of the genres of folklore, the saga, legend, and märchen. So we already discussed about myths. Now let's discuss and compare these genres of folklore to it. For the first one, we have saga. While the myth is ancient history and is concerned with maintaining order in the framework of life, saga is closer to a locale and connected to a particular historical event and locations. If the time setting in myth is unidentified, In saga, it is told directly. And if myths are concerned more about the concept of the supernatural, sagas are more concerned about the locale and the ordinary people. And like myth, saga has a theological meaning. The characters depicted are mainly noble figures who supposedly played a vital role in great events. And sagas, they are usually long stories about heroic events. An example of this is a novel written by Leo Tolstoy entitled War and Peace. For the next one, we have legend. The term legend comes from the early church period when it was customary to read the accounts of the saints or martyrs at divine service or on their feast days, particularly in monastic communities. Its characters often deals with figures of piety, models deserving of respect, which inspire admiration and emulation. But aside from this, like myths, legends also explains natural phenomena, religious practices, and human nature. But legends usually focuses on an individual character, like for example, a cultural hero or a person respected and remembered. For example, King Arthur and William Tell. But unlike myths, the legend's settings happened in a more recent historical past. For the last one, we have Märchen. So Märchen is a German word for fairy tale. Märchen are not concerned with real people or events, opposed to all other kinds of narratives, but constructs its own world and its own time. So the characters here in Märchen are usually all about trolls, goblins, fairies, gnomes, giants, and the like. So it's completely fictional. The Märchen and the myth are closely related in their origin. In both forms of narrative, the same primitive view of the world and of life is clearly present. But what in the myth takes place in the sphere of reality is, in the Märchen, consciously elevated into the realm of fantasy and its regulated play. So both myth and Märchen has the same stories about the supernatural. But myth takes place in the sphere of reality, while Märchen takes place in the realm of pure fantasy. So our next topic is about the origin and development of mythology. In here, we're going to discuss the influence of idealism and romanticism. Idealism is a representation of things in an ideal form, while romanticism emphasizes on the inspiration, subjectivity, and the primacy of the individual. As a backlash towards the Enlightenment, German idealism and romanticism rediscovered myths and judged them mainly from an aesthetic point of view as romantic or literary creations. The mythical creation was considered an individual contribution of the creative imagination, meaning the people during this time period did not take myth seriously and just considered them as a mere individual contribution of the creative imagination. Now let's discuss the people who judge, criticize, and try to explain mythology's roots. For the first one, we have David Hume. So he built his study of myths into an area of scientific science. He argued that mythological myths are kind of primitive interpretation of nature and that their roots should be found in the emotional domain. The factor that impels people to formulate mythical religious concepts are hope and particularly fear. So basically, he's saying that mythologies are created only because of humans' emotional domain, particularly their hope and fear. He firmly did not accept the idea that myths are real. So for the next one, we have Wilhelm Wundt. Wundt made a new advanced investigation of myths, and just like David Hume, he regarded the emotions as the sources of myths. But the possibility of the emotions leading to mythical ideas is to be ultimately ascribed to the imagination. Through the apperception of things as people, it is possible for man to objectify his emotional states. Wundt, nevertheless, did not yet have clearly in view the specific elements in the feelings and imagination that produces myths. So for Hume, we have emotion, and for Wundt, we have emotion and imagination. Next up, we have Rudolf Otto. His definition of the emotional states that affect man in the presence of the numinous is distinguished in particular by his perception that religious sentiment is something different. The main concern is the state of the emotion. The theories merely swarm around it as fictional creations. So just like those who preceded him, he believes that mythologies are only rooted from humans' emotions. Now, as for Ernst Cassirer, he studied the myth phenomenon more from an epistemological point of view than from a psychological point of view. Epistemological coming from the word epistemology, which is the theory of knowledge. So Cassirer used a method that is based on the theory of knowledge in analyzing myths. The symbolism of the myth remained a sort of primitive understanding of life, which gave rise to scientific knowledge and its creation. So he was saying that myths are created as some sort of symbolism for us people to have a better understanding about the primitive way of life. And myths became a huge help in the creation of scientific knowledge. So next we got Paul Tillich. So for him, myth falls under the category of the unconditioned or the otherworldly being to which the religious act is guided. The myth selects its own objects, which it creates as representations of the unconditioned. So for him, he recognized myths as mere symbols. He argues that any attempt to remove the mythological from our consciousness will be unsuccessful, because myths signify a collection of symbols which stand for our own ultimate concern. For him, myths are just symbolic language of faith. Next one we have Sigmund Freud, a name you have most likely encountered for a bunch of times already. So Freud's take in analyzing myths is from a psychological, but specifically in a psychoanalytic point of view. So he considered myths to be the manifestation of hidden desires. He enunciated a psychological rule that precipitates repression in a symbolic expression, a finding that has served as a basis for the psychoanalysis of the sense of dreams. Freud's conception of the origin of humanity from primeval occurrences and of primeval sin has always been of great impact, the lasting result of which he called the Oedipus complex. So Freud pinpointed that myths came from humans' hidden desires. An example of this is the Oedipus complex, coming from a Greek mythology character named Oedipus. So Oedipus unknowingly killed his own father and married his own mother. And in psychology today, Oedipus complex is a condition where a child has a desire for sexual involvement with the parent of the opposite sex and a concomitant sense of rivalry with the parent of the same sex. So Freud views myth as just a disguise for human desire. For the last one, we have Carl Jung. And just like Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung's take on mythology is from a psychological point of view. Symbol formations understood and evaluated on a purely individual basis are interpreted by Carl Jung as an authentic expression of super-individual truths of life, the starting point for the life of the individual ego. With the help of his concept of the collective unconscious and of archetypes as the forms under which it makes its appearance, Jung attempted to break through the barriers of individual psychology and to make dreams and myths function as the symbols in which hidden transcendence as such manifests itself in the worlds of human consciousness. So, Jung believed that myths and dreams were expressions of the collective unconscious, in that they express core ideas that are part of the human species as a whole. In other words, myths express wisdom that has been encoded in all humans, perhaps by means of evolution or through some spiritual process. Now let's move on to the types of mythology. So there are four types of mythology, namely the animal, creation, death or underworld, and hero mythology. So for the first one, we have animal mythology. Animals were commonly granted unique powers in ancient stories and intended to inspire a nation to accomplish greater achievements. Examples of these are, the first one is How the Bear Lost His Tail. So it is a story about a deceitful fox and a greedy bear who wanted to show off his long tail. One winter day, Fox told Bear by dipping his tail into the water to fish in a frozen part of the pond. Bear fell asleep when he did so, and the water pooled around his neck. Bear jumped up when Fox woke him, and much of his tail flew off. Next one is a story about the phoenix. So in many cultures, the phoenix legend exists, like for example in Greek, Egyptian, and Indian mythology. The phoenix is generally depicted as a bright eagle or similar creature, and is associated with the rising sun. Once a phoenix knows his time is coming to an end after a long existence, he builds a funeral pyre. After the fire destroying the old phoenix, a new one emerges. So our next story came from Australian mythology. Um, the Kangaroo Gets a Pouch tells the story of a kind mama kangaroo who rescued her son from hunters as well as a stray wombat. The wombat told the mom kangaroo after the ordeal that he was the lord of all things and that he wanted to reward her goodness. He ordered her to place a bark over her butt. Lo and behold, a bug turns up. Now she'd have a way to keep her son safe, Joey. For the next story, we have Hugin and Munin. So they are a pair of ravens in Norse mythology which serve Odin and are even considered an extension of him. They traveled around the world telling him what they see, giving him advice and following him into war. So the last one is why chipmunks have stripes. So it is a myth from the Native American Seneca has also tried to explain why chipmunks have stripes. One day, a chipmunk bear proclaimed he could do something. The chipmunk asked him if he could avoid the rising sun. The chipmunk made fun of him after the bear tried and lost. Enraged, the bear pinned one foot on the chipmunk. The chipmunk managed to get free, but with a new collection of stripes that were created by the paws of the bear. Next one, we have the creation mythology. So this is used as a way to understand the present state and to assume that mysterious gods or monsters created the universe. Examples of the stories under creation myths are, first one is the Pueblo. So the Pueblo believe they began life underground and were guided by a spirit to climb up through a hole into the earth. Once there, they found suitable land where the gods taught them how to farm, build houses, and create communities. Next one, we have the Inuit. The Inuit believed first there were giants. Two giants had a baby named Sedna, who became so large they could no longer feed her. Because of this, they threw her into the ocean, cutting off her fingers when she tried to cling to the kayak. Each finger became a sea creature. Sedna became a powerful spirit who controlled the sea and its animals. Next one, we have Children of Limocon. So, in a Filipino myth, the children of the Limocon were powerful birds that could talk. On the banks of Mayo River, they laid two eggs. These eggs became the first man and woman who married and had many children. Next one we have the Ikoi. In southern Nigeria, the Ikoi believed there were two gods in the beginning, Obasi Oso of the sky and Obasi Nisi of the land. Oso created the first man and woman. Nisi taught them how to survive. When they died, Nisi took them down into the earth. Next one, we have Odin, Norse mythology. In Norse mythology, Odin, the father of all gods, and his brothers Vili and Ve slew the first giant Ymir and made the world out of his body and the first humans out of tree trunks. For the last one, we have Firstborn, Papago mythology. So Firstborn came to the world when it was only darkness and water and completed the creation of the world. After he prepared the earth, Ituwai, or the elder brother, was created, then Coyote and Buzzard, and together they finished the world, its people, and creatures. So the next one is the death or the underworld mythology. It deals with coping with destruction, death, and dying. It also symbolizes rebirth as much as death. Examples of these are, first is Balder from Norse mythology. So in Norse mythology, Balder was immune from harm. So the gods had fun throwing things at him. One day, trickster Loki gave the blind god Hoder mistletoe to throw at Balder, the only thing that could hurt him, and he died. Balder could only return from death if everyone in the world cried for him. Only the giantess Thok, actually Loki in disguise, refused to shed tears, so Balder had to stay in the underworld. The next one is the story of Quetzalcoatl from Aztec mythology. Quetzalcoatl created mankind in its current incarnation, the fifth sun, by journeying to Mictlan, the underworld, and using his blood to give new life to the bones of those who had lived in the previous eras. For the next one, we have Ma'at from Egyptian mythology. Ma'at was the goddess who decided who would enter the underworld. When people died, their hearts were placed on one side of a scale. The other side of the scale held Ma'at's feather of truth. If their heart was heavier than the feather, they were sent to their second death. For the last one, and probably the most famous one, we have Hades from Greek mythology. Hades was the ruler of the Greek underworld. Hades rarely left his kingdom, but did not want to rule alone, so he kidnapped Persephone to be his queen. Distraught, her mother Demeter, goddess of agriculture, let the crops die until Zeus finally intervened. Persephone was then destined to spend 6 months of the year with Hades and 6 months with Demeter. Next one we got the hero mythology. So hero mythology illustrates admirable human traits such as valor and morality. Examples of these are, first one we have Hercules or Heracles in Greek mythology. The most famous hero is probably Hercules. To pay for a crime, he had to complete a set of heroic tasks. He also helped the Olympians arise victorious in their battle against the giants. He was the last mortal son of Zeus, but also the only mortal to become a god upon death. Next one is also from Greek mythology, and his name is Achilles. Achilles was also a Greek hero. He was the son of a king and a nymph. When he was born, his mother wanted him to be immortal or invincible, so she dipped him in the river Styx in the underworld. However, she was holding him by his heel. mistakenly leaving that part of his body vulnerable. Achilles went on to command legions of men in the Trojan War. He died when a poisoned arrow struck that one part of his body which remained mortal. This is why we have an idiomatic expression about Achilles' heel. It means like it is your weakness. So the next one we have Karna, a Hindu warrior. So Karna was the greatest Hindu warrior ever known. His martial arts were indeed epic, and he went on to conquer the entire world. He single-handedly carried out a military campaign, defending every king in the world, or defeating every king in the world rather. Next one we have Beowulf, a Scandinavian hero. Beowulf was a Scandinavian hero, immortalized in a medieval poem, a brave warrior who fought and conquered the monsters that terrorized Denmark and Sweden. He not only depicted moral virtues, but also lived an adventure-filled life. Last one is also from Greek mythology, and his name is Perseus. Perseus is another central character in Greek mythology. He was considered the greatest Greek hero, as on an epic journey, he slew Medusa and saved Andromeda from the sea monster. So our last discussion for today is about the 6 classifications of myths, namely the cosmogonic myth, theogonic, anthropogenic, myths of the primitive state of cosmos and man, savior, and the eschatological myth. So the first one is a cosmogonic myth. It deals with origins, and by its nature, it is always cosmic in scope, a direct act on the part of the creator or through emanation from a primeval being or nature. Cosmogonic myth speaks usually of a long and highly imaginative development in which a primeval being is divided or split up to constitute a multiform world. So cosmogonic myth is also known as the creation myth. It is a symbolic narrative of how the world began and how people first came to inhabit it. Though this is a classification of myth which should not be regarded as real, creation myths of particular cultures are still believed to be true by its members. Next one is the theogonic myth. The creation of gods is the theme of these myths. Theogonic myths can be regarded also as a part of cosmogony because it also deals with stories of creation. An example of this is the theogony of Hesiod, which centers around the ascendancy of Zeus and all the other Greek gods. Anthropogonic myth. The origin of man frequently plays an important role in mythology. Anthropogony can be emphasized also in a more naturalistic fashion. Anthropogonic myth with inventive imagination depicts the contemporary view of the nature and function of man. If the first 2 classifications dealt more about the gods, anthropogonic myth deals with the origin of humans and their function. It also tackles the contemporary view of nature. Next one is the myths of the primitive state of the cosmos and man. Myths dealing with this theme not only describe the original state of the cosmos, but are intended specially to furnish information on the processes that led to subsequent and present conditions. So this classification of myth tries to explain the original state of the universe, aiming to explain why and how the world or the universe today came to be. Next one is the savior myth. The myth of the savior god is closely connected, especially with the mystery of cults, and is often a further development of earlier agricultural myths. So savior myths deals more with an individual character that played an important role in saving the world. Example of this is the Messiah, or Jesus Christ, that came from Christian mythology. So the last classification of myth we're going to tackle is eschatological myth. Eschatological myths have a much less extensive distribution. It usually portrays the final time as a period of dramatic cosmic events. So if the other myths deals with the creation of the world and mankind, eschatological myths deals with the end of times. It centers around the gods' vindication of their justice, and it talks more about the end of the world and the apocalypse. And that ends our discussion. Thank you for listening. I hope to see you on the next lesson.